Hello, and welcome to my talk on representation, deflationism, and the question of realism. Before I introduce the problem that I want to talk about, a few words about expressivism, about normative discourse. Broadly speaking, this is the view that normative claims express desire-like mental states, like plans or attitudes of approval and disapproval. Traditionally, expressivists also held that normative claims do not aim to describe normative facts and cannot be true or false. So their theory was in conflict with normative realism, the view that there are objective normative facts and many of our beliefs about these facts are true. However, this contrast between expressivism and realism has become blurred in recent decades. This is because expressivists like Simon Blackburn and Alan Gibbard have endorsed some central claims of normative realism, like the claim that there are objective normative facts, by adopting a minimalist or deflationary account of truth, fact, and other related notions. On this deflationary view, realist commitments are interpreted as internal to normative discourse. For instance, to say that it is a fact that genocide is wrong is equivalent to saying that genocide is wrong. Nevertheless, Blackburn and Gibbard label their view quasi-realism, a term meant to convey that, for all these realist-sounding claims, this is still meant to be an anti-realist conception of normativity. However, it is far from clear how we can distinguish between this view and genuine realism, given that quasi-realists seem able to endorse a deflationary version of anything that realists might want to say about normative reality and our access to it. This challenge of isolating a divide between quasi-realism and genuine realism has become known as the problem of creeping minimalism due to a 2004 paper by Jamie Dreyer. The most promising answer to this problem is the explanation, or explanationism, which was proposed by Dreyer himself and by others in recent years. The general idea is that quasi-realists and realists might agree in their claims about truth, objectivity, or knowledge, but they disagree about how to explain the content of normative judgments. More specifically, Dreyer focuses on the explanatory role of normative entities. As he puts it, realists appeal to normative facts and properties when explaining what it is to have a normative belief or to make a normative claim, while expressivists appeal instead to desire-like attitudes. Let's call this ontological explanationism. Now, one problem with Dreyer's proposal, pointed out by Matthew Kreisman, is that it runs into trouble when dealing with false claims in any domain of discourse, because their content cannot easily be explained by appeal to corresponding entities. A different version of explanationism proposed by Matthew Simpson avoids this problem. On this view, the contrast between quasi-realism and realism is best stated in terms of the explanatory role of representation. Realists claim that representational relations play a substantive role in explanations of normative meaning, while quasi-realists deny this. And here, representational relations include truth, reference, and representation itself. To be sure, quasi-realists can accept in a deflationary framework that normative claims are truth-apt or representational, but they deny that these features of normative discourse play a role in explanations of meaning, and this is the sense in which they are anti-realists, according to this proposal. Simpson's view also matches Blackburn's and Gibbard's recent statements about what distinguishes their quasi-realism from a representationalist approach to normative discourse. Here is Blackburn, for instance, in a recent paper. Representation is not the key concept to deploy when the desire for philosophical explanation of our practice in some area is upon us. It is not the way to understand the kind of thought or the part of language in question. So, to sum up Simpson's proposal, it seems plausible that all realists about domain D accept the following thesis, which I will label RE for representational explanationism. Representational relations explain attributions of meaning to sentences in D. Expressivists reject RE, and this is what their anti-realism consists in, or so the story goes. Now, in the rest of this talk, I will argue against representational explanationism. More precisely, I will argue that if we adopt a deflationary approach to the relevant metaphysical and semantic notions, Simpson's proposal does not draw a stable contrast between expressivism and anything recognizable as a plausible notion of normative realism. My case will take the form of a dilemma. If realist explanations of meaning are understood to involve general semantic notions like reference or representation, then such explanations are indeed in conflict with quasi-realism. but this explanatory contrast does not provide us with a useful notion of realism in a deflationary framework. That is, a notion that would allow someone to be a quasi-realist about normativity and a realist about, say, mid-sized dry goods. If we focus instead on explanations of meaning in terms of causal tracking relations between language and the world, then this again does not deliver a plausible criterion for realism in metaethics, because it leaves out some standard versions of normative realism. And this dilemma also applies to any disjunction of explanations of meaning that might be put forward as a criterion for realism. Either some of these disjuncts will be incompatible with deflationism, or the disjunction as a whole will leave out some versions of realism. The upshot of all this is that in a deflationary framework, expressivism should be seen as compatible with genuine realism. In making this case, I will focus on Simpson's representational explanationism, but my arguments can be extended to other versions of explanationism as well, including Dreyer's. Let me begin with the first horn of the dilemma. I will assume a deflationary theory of truth, facts, and other related metaphysical and semantic notions like property, reference, or representation. This is a controversial philosophical view, but it's a key part of the quasi-realist project, and it has become the framework for this debate about how we can distinguish quasi-realism and realism. In particular, I will rely on the following deflationary theses about representation, because this notion plays a key role in Simpson's explanationism. First, for a sentence to be representational, it is enough for it to have a declarative form and to be governed by sufficient standards of warrant. And secondly, the notion of representation, understood as a general semantic notion, plays no substantive explanatory role in the theory of meaning. So note the qualification in thesis 2. What deflationism rejects is explanations of meaning in terms of general semantic notions like truth, reference, or representation, which can be applied in principle to a wide range of domains of discourse. But this is compatible with local explanations of meaning, for example, for our terms for mid-sized dry goods, which appeal to tracking relations between words and corresponding things in the world. And I will come back to this in a minute. Now, here is my first argument against RE as a criterion for realism. If we understand RE as referring to representation as a general semantic notion, then it is indeed in conflict with expressivism. Expressivist explanations of meaning will not rely on representational relations between normative language and the normative realm. Moreover, combining expressivism with deflationism reinforces this conflict, given that deflationism itself rejects an explanatory role for representation in the theory of meaning more generally. However, this is not a good way to understand the divide between quasi-realism and realism, precisely because it relies on attributing to realists explanations of meaning that are incompatible with deflationism. Here's what I take to be a constraint on any good response to the problem of creeping minimalism. It should provide a criterion for realism that is compatible with a deflationary framework. And this criterion should allow someone to be a quasi-realist about normativity and a realist in other domains of discourse. But RE understood in terms of general semantic notions fails to deliver such a criterion, precisely due to the wide reach of deflationism. Deflationism applies to all domains of discourse, not just to normative discourse. It denies that representational relations explain meaning even for paradigmatically descriptive regions of discourse, like our claims about mid-sized dry goods. This means that the deflationist rejection of RE does not allow us to draw a contrast between domains of discourse where realism holds true, like our claims about tables or trees, and areas amenable to a quasi-realist account, like normative discourse. In other words, from a deflationary standpoint, realism defined in terms of RE disappears as a theoretical option in all areas of discourse. So the acceptance of RE cannot constitute a plausible criterion for normative realism. Now, a key premise in the argument I just gave was the claim that quasi-realists must reject an explanatory role for representational relations in all domains of discourse. But someone might object that this ignores a type of representationalist explanation of meaning that is not undermined by deflationism, namely causal explanations that appeal to tracking relations between language and the world to explain the emergence and use of certain bits of language. perhaps we can still articulate a divide between quasi-realism and genuine realism in terms of these tracking relations. Indeed, Blackburn and Gibbard themselves often invoke such explanations of meaning when articulating the sense in which normative discourse is not representational. Gibbard, for example, says that environmental tracking is a paradigm of representation, which can be used to distinguish between genuinely descriptive language and those areas of language which only mimic genuine description, like normative discourse. Moreover, Simpson appeals precisely to tracking explanations of meaning to argue that deflationism does not undermine his version of explanationism. Expressivists can still say that normative discourse is non-representational in an interesting sense, he argues, given that on their view normative content is not amenable to tracking explanations, while they do accept that such explanations are available in other areas of discourse. This brings us to the second horn of my dilemma for representational explanationism. I agree that there is a narrow, naturalistic notion of representation, understood in terms of tracking relations, which is compatible with deflationism, and which allows us to say that normative discourse is non-representational in a substantive sense. Again, deflationism rejects an explanatory role for representation understood as a general semantic notion, but it is compatible with explanations of meaning that appeal to tracking relations in some areas of discourse. But this naturalistic notion of representation cannot be used to answer the question of realism in metaethics. This is because standard forms of non-naturalist realism, like the views defended by David Enoch or William Fitzpatrick, also reject tracking explanations of meaning, given that they take normative facts and properties to be causally inert, and these views should be covered by any plausible criterion for normative realism. Therefore, the appeal to tracking explanations of meaning cannot vindicate RE as an account of the divide between quasi-realism and realism either. Someone might argue that the two horns of my dilemma do not exhaust the options for explanationism. We shouldn't look for a unique explanatory commitment that is characteristic of all forms of realism, the argument would go. No matter whether this is a commitment to tracking explanations or to explanations of meaning in terms of general semantic notions. Perhaps the right way to understand RE is in a disjunctive way. A view is committed to RE if it endorses either tracking explanations of meaning or other kinds of meta-semantic explanations that involve representational relations. This might give us a criterion for realism that covers all forms of normative realism. For instance, someone might suggest that the explanatory commitments of non-naturalist realism can be captured in terms of a non-causal notion of tracking or representation. If this were to work, perhaps this will give us a second disjunct that we need in a successful criterion for realism. However, I do not see how this suggestion can avoid the dilemma I have raised for explanationism. I believe that any explanatory criterion that will cover standard forms of non-naturalist realism will have to invoke inflationary semantic notions, like reference understood as a metaphysical relation between normative terms and normative entities. But precisely for this reason, no such criterion can be a good response to the problem of creeping minimalism, because it will still rely on ascribing to realists explanatory commitments that are incompatible with deflationism. To sum up, I have argued that we cannot find any good account of the divide between quasi-realism and realism in terms of their conflicting explanations of meaning, because no explanatory criterion for realism will be both compatible with deflationism and comprehensive enough to cover all standard versions of realism. The upshot of all this is that in a deflationary framework, expressivists should think of their views compatible with genuine realism. But this is good news, I believe. Instead of thinking of deflationism as creating a problem in metaethics, I think we should see it as a tool for reconciling two metaethical views which both have important virtues. Both expressivism and realism capture central features of normative discourse, like its action-guiding character, or its acrimoniousness, or its aspiration to truth and objectivity. And I believe it is a benefit of deflationism if it enables us to endorse a metaethical view that delivers all these goods. This has been my talk on representation, deflationism, and the question of realism. Thank you for watching.